Hi, welcome back to Reading with me. My name is Lauren and I own and run and teach at a little learning center called Omatis in Johannesburg. We're currently reading the epic book, The Hobbit. Tonight or today or in this video, we're going to be reading chapter 6. I'm not too sure if we're going to finish it because we're going to want to read for about 20 minutes. Anything more than that and it's really tough to keep concentrating, I know. So I hope that you've got the book. There are so many versions of the book. So I'm hoping that the one that I'm reading is matching the one that you've got. If it's different, let me know and I'll source something out, because Tolkien, or it might not have been him, but the book was revised to match up with either Lord of the Rings or the movie, or I must do a bit more research around this, but there's definitely at least two versions of the story. So this is my one. This copy I bought it some time ago, so it's not the newest one on the shelf. It seems like this one is 1995, so you might have a newer version, but I think that it should be similar to what you've got. I'm hoping it is. But there's definitely an older, more sort of original version to this. But that aside, the story is fantastic. So if you're not able to read along with me, then you're listening. If you're reading with me and you're able to keep up and use your tracking skills and see the words, then you're developing your sound symbol connection in your brain. So you're developing your decoding skills when it comes to visually seeing a word. By listening to me, you are developing your auditory sense of words and how sounds are produced and how fluency of reading is created and works. So no matter what you're doing, you're developing your reading and comprehension skills, which, good on you. You are self-improving, which is fantastic. So without talking too much more, let's get started on chapter 6. It is super important that you try to remember what we have read so far. Those remembering times it's building your memory muscle. So in your brain, you have a little portion in the center that's called the hippocampus, and that part is your memory center, and it connects with other parts of your brain, but basically it kind of works like a muscle. The more you try to remember things, the more able you are to remember things. So the more often you remember what we've already read, the more you will remember what we've already read. So it kind of, the more it comes out, the more it stays in, right? It's like repetition. But not only that, the more often you try to remember anything, your memory ability gets stronger. So every time you prepare to read or listen to a new reading of the book, before you do that, sit back and think, right, where were we? What happened last? Where have they been? Do I remember specific details? And try to build that memory muscle. So just to give you a start, sorry, I've got an itchy nose. Just to give you a start of remembering, we did a whole chapter, 2 videos on the last chapter, where Bilbo, who's the Hobbit from the Shire, with the big hairy feet, he was in the goblin cave, because remember they sought out shelter from the storm. There were 2 thunderstorms clashing, and the ponies were taken by the goblins, and now you're remembering all those details. And the last chapter was where Bilbo tripped or fell or found himself separated from the dwarves, and he found a ring, and then Gollum found him, and then they had to play this riddle game. And then he put his hand in his pocket and the ring popped on his finger and he was suddenly invisible. So I bet you as I talk about those things, more things are coming to mind. Now the best way to remember things is to turn them into pictures in your head. So if you've seen the movie's pretty accurate. So you might be able to link what you remember from the reading to pictures you have from the movie. If you haven't seen the movie, then you have created your own version of the characters in your head. So your Bilbo might have blonde hair or might do a little more hopping like a rabbit. Your Bilbo is going to look like your Bilbo. And that's how you pull those details out. You link into those visual images that you have in your mind, and that's what gives you more and more detail. because we can think in a lot of detail. We can imagine in a lot of detail, more detail than we can remember the words. So turn the words into a story, into a picture for yourself this time, for this chapter 6, and see if that helps you remember more for the next time. So these are skills that you can practice over and over and over again, and in fun ways. Reading a book like this. You're not even studying and you're developing these skills. So let's go on to reading chapter 6, called Out of the Frying Pan and Into the Fire. And if you remember in the last chapter, I spoke to you about what that meant. It means going from one sticky situation or bad situation into another one. So he didn't get out of the cave. He found himself first with Gollum, and then, so now what is the fire? So the frying pan was being with Gollum. What is now the fire? So let's read on. Okay, Bilbo had escaped the goblins, but he did not know where he was. He had lost hood, cloak, food, pony, his buttons, and his friends. He wandered on and on till the sun began to sink westward behind the mountains. Their shadows fell across Bilbo's path, and he looked back. Then he looked forward and could see before him only ridges and slopes falling towards lowlands and plains, glimpsed occasionally between the trees. "Good heavens!" he exclaimed. "I seem to have got right to the other side of the misty mountains, right to the edge of the land beyond. Where, and oh, where can Gandalf and the dwarves have got to? I only hope to goodness they are not still back there in the power of the goblins." He still wandered on, out of the little high valley, over its edge, and down the slopes beyond. But all the while a very uncomfortable thought was growing inside him. He wondered whether he ought not, now he had the magic ring, to go back into the horrible, horrible tunnels and look for his friends. He had just made up his mind that it was his duty, that he must turn back, and very miserable he felt about it, when he heard voices. He stopped and listened. It did not sound like goblins, so he crept forward carefully. He was on a stony path winding downwards, with a rocky wall on the left hand. On the other side the ground sloped away, and there were dells below the level of the path, overhung with bushes and low trees. In one of these dells, under the bushes, people were talking. He crept still nearer, and suddenly he saw, peering between two big boulders, a head with a red hood on it. It was Balin. It was Balin doing Look Out. He could not have clapped and shouted for joy. He could have clapped and shouted for joy, but he did not. He had still got the ring on for fear of meeting something unexpected and unpleasant, and he saw that Balin was looking straight at him without noticing him. "I will give him a surprise," he thought, as he crawled into the bushes at the edge of the dell. Gandalf was arguing with the dwarves. They were discussing all that had happened to them in the tunnels, and wondering and debating what they were to do now. The dwarves were grumbling, and Gandalf was saying that they could not possibly go on their journey leaving Mr. Baggins in the hands of the goblins without trying to find out if he was alive or dead, and without trying to rescue him. "After all, he is my friend," said the wizard, "and not a bad little chap. I feel responsible for him. I wish to goodness you had not lost him." The dwarves wanted to know why he had ever been brought at all, why he could not stick to his friends and come along with them, and why the wizard had not chosen someone with more sense. "He has been more trouble than use so far," said one. "If we have got to go back now into these abominable tunnels to look for him, then drat him, I say." Gandalf answered angrily, "I brought him, and I don't bring things that are of no use. Either you help me to look for him, or I go and leave you here to get out of the mess as best you can yourselves. If we can only find him again, you will thank me before all is over. Whatever did you want to go and drop him for, Dory?" Because remember, Dory was carrying him like, as a piggyback, and Dory dropped him, and that's how Bilbo Baggins got lost. You would have dropped him, said Dory, if a goblin had suddenly grabbed your legs from behind in the dark, tripped up your feet and kicked you in the back. Then why didn't you pick him up again? Good heavens! Can you ask? Goblins fighting and biting in the dark, everybody falling over bodies and hitting one another. You nearly chopped off my head with Glamdring, and Thorin was stabbing here and there and everywhere with Orcrist. All of a sudden, you gave one of your blinding flashes, and we saw the goblins running back yelping. You shouted, "Follow me, everyone," and everyone ought to have followed. We thought everyone had. There was no time to count, as you know quite well, till we had dashed through the gate guards, out of the lower door, and helter-skelter down here. And here we are, without the burglar. Confiscate him. Confusticate. I'm going to have to look up that word. And here's the burglar, said Bilbo, stepping down into the middle of them, slipping off the ring. Bless me, how they jumped. Then they shouted with surprise and delight. Gandalf was as astonished as any of them, but probably more pleased than all the others. He called to Balin and told him that what he thought of a lookout man who let people walk right into them like that without warning. It is a fact that Bilbo's reputation went up a very great deal with the dwarves after this. If they had still doubted that he was really a first-class burglar, in spite of Gandalf's words, they doubted no longer, because he had snuck past Balin. Balin was the most puzzled of all, but everyone said it was a very clever bit of work. Indeed, Bilbo was so pleased with their praise that he just chuckled inside and said nothing whatever about the ring. And when they asked him how he did it, he said, "Oh, just crept along, you know, very carefully and quietly." Well, it is the first time that even a mouse has crept along carefully and quietly under my very nose and not been spotted, said Balin. And I take off my hood to you, which he did. It's like, take off your hat. Balin at your service, he said. Your servant, Mr. Baggins, said Bilbo. Then they wanted to know all about his adventures after they had lost him, and he sat down and told them everything, except about the finding of the ring. Not just now, he thought. They were particularly interested in the riddle competition, and shuddered most appreciatively at his description of Gollum. And then I couldn't think of any other questions with him sitting beside me, ended Bilbo. So I said, "What's in my pocket?" And he couldn't guess in 3 goes, so I said, "What about your promise? Show me the way out." But he came at me to kill me, and I ran and fell over, and he missed me in the dark. That's a bit of a lie, isn't it? Because he doesn't want to tell anyone about the ring. Then I followed him because I heard him talking to himself. I thought I really knew the way out, and so he was making for it. And then he sat down in the entrance, and I could not get by. So I jumped over him and escaped and ran down to the gate. What about the guards? They asked. Weren't there any? Oh, yes, lots of them. But I dodged them. I got stuck in the door, which was only open a crack, and I lost lots of buttons, he said sadly, looking at his torn clothes. But I squeezed through all right, and here I am. The dwarves looked at him with quite a new respect when he talked about dodging guards, jumping over Gollum, and squeezing through, as if it was not very difficult or very alarming. What did I tell you? Said Gandalf, laughing. Mr. Baggins has more about him than you guess. He gave Bilbo a queer look from under his bushy eyebrows as he said this, and the Hobbit wondered if he guessed at the part of his tale that he had left out. Then he had questions of his own to ask, for if Gandalf had explained it all by now to the dwarves, Bilbo had not heard it. He wanted to know how the wizard had turned up again, and where they had all got to now. The wizard, to tell the truth, never minded explaining his cleverness more than once. So now he told Bilbo that both he and Elrond had been well aware of the presence of evil goblins in that part of the mountains, but their main gates used to come out on a different pass, one more easy to travel by, so that they often caught people benighted near their gates. Benighted. Maybe holed up for the night? Evidently, people had given up going that way, and the goblins must have opened their new entrance at the top of the pass the dwarves had taken quite recently, because it had been found quite safe up until now. I must see if I can't find a more or less decent giant to block it up again, said Gandalf, or soon there will be no getting over the mountain at all. As soon as Gandalf had heard Bilbo's yell, he realized what had happened. In the flash which killed the goblins that were grabbing him and had nipped inside the crack, just as it snapped to, he followed. Sorry, I'm going to start that again. So what happens when you're reading and you're not too sure what's going on? You've got to stop and kind of go back and maybe slow it down a little bit. So that's what I'm going to do to help myself with fluency. Because these are long sentences. As soon as Gandalf had heard Bilbo's yell, he realized what had happened. In the flash which killed the goblins that were grabbing him, he had nipped inside the crack, just as it snapped to. He followed after the drivers and prisoners right to the edge of the great hall, and there he sat down and worked up the best magic he could in the shadows. That's a very good trick. So when you're not too sure, you slow it down. A very ticklish business it was, he said, touch and go. But, of course, Gandalf had made a special study of bewitchments with fire and lights. Even the Hobbit had never forgotten the magic fireworks at Old Took's Midsummer Eve parties, as you remember. The rest we all know, except that Gandalf knew all about the back door, as the goblins called the lower gate, where Bilbo lost his buttons. As a matter of fact, it was well known to anybody who was acquainted with this part of the mountains, but it took a wizard to keep his head in the tunnels and guide them in the right direction. They made that gate ages ago, he said, partly for a way of escape if they needed one, partly as a way out into the lands beyond, where they still come in the dark and do great damage. They guard it always, and no one has ever managed to block it up. They will guard it doubly after this, he laughed. All the others laughed too. After all, they had lost a good deal, but they had killed the great goblin and a great many others besides, and they had all escaped, so they might be said to have had the best of it so far. But the wizard called them to their senses. We must be getting on at once, now we are a little rested, he said. They will be out after us in hundreds when night comes on, and already shadows are lengthening. They can smell our footsteps for hours and hours after we have passed. We must be miles on before dusk. There will be a bit of moon if it keeps fine, and that is lucky. Not that they mind the moon much, but it will give us a little light to steer by. Oh yes, he said in answer to more questions from the Hobbit. You lose track of time inside goblin tunnels. Today's Thursday, and it was Monday night or Tuesday morning that we were captured. We have gone miles and miles and come right down through the heart of the mountains and are now on the other side. Quite a shortcut. But we are not at the point to which our pass would have been brought to us. We are too far to the north and have some awkward country ahead, and we are still pretty high up. Let's get on. I'm dreadfully hungry, groaned Bilbo, who was suddenly aware that he had not had a meal since the night before last. Just think of that for a hobbit. His stomach felt all empty and loose and his legs all wobbly, now the excitement was over. Can't help it, said Gandalf, unless you like to go back and ask the goblins nicely to let you have your pony back and your luggage. No, thank you, said Bilbo. Very well then. We must just tighten our belts and trudge on, or we shall be made into supper, and that will be much worse than having none ourselves. As they went on, Bilbo looked from side to side for something to eat. But the blackberries were still only in flower, and of course there were no nuts, not even hawthorn berries. He nibbled a bit of sorrel, and he drank from a small mountain stream that crossed the path, and he ate 3 wild strawberries that he found on its banks, but it was not much good. They still went on and on. The rough path had disappeared. The bushes and the long grasses between the boulders, the patches of rabbit-cropped turf, the thyme and the sage and the marjoram, and the yellow rock roses all vanished, and they found themselves at the top of a wide, steep slope of fallen stones, the remains of a landslide. When they began to go down this, rubbish and small pebbles rolled away from their feet. Soon larger bits of split stone went clattering down and started other pieces below them slithering and rolling. Then lumps of rock were disturbed and bounded off, crashing down with a dust and a noise. Before long the whole slope above them and below them seemed to be on the move, and they were sliding away, huddled all together and in a fearful confusion of slipping, rattling, cracking slabs and stones. It was the trees at the bottom that saved them. They slid into the edge of a climbing wood of pines that here stood right up the mountain slope from the deeper, darker forest of the valley below. Some caught hold of the trunks and swung themselves into lower branches. Some, like the little Hobbit, got behind a tree to shelter from the onslaught of the rocks. Soon the danger was over. The slide had stopped, and the last faint crashes could be heard as the largest of the disturbed stones went bounding and spitting among the bracken and the pine roots far below. "Well, that has got us on a bit," said Gandalf, "and even goblins tracking us will have a job to come down here quietly." "I dare say," grumbled Bombor, "but they won't find it difficult to send stones bouncing down on our heads." The dwarves and Bilbo were feeling far from happy and were rubbing their bruised and damaged legs and feet. "Nonsense, we are going to turn aside here out of the path of the slide. We must be quick. Look at the light." The sun had long gone behind the mountains. Already the shadows were deepening about them, though far away through the trees and over the black tops of those growing lower down, they could still see the evening lights on the plains beyond. They limped along now as fast as they were able, down the gentle slopes of a pine forest in a slanting path leading steadily southwards. At times they were pushing through a sea of bracken, with tall fronds rising right above the Hobbit's head. At times they were marching along quiet over a floor of pine needles. And all the while the forest gloom got heavier and the forest silence deeper. There was no wind that evening to bring even a sea sighing into the branches of the trees. Okay, should I go on? I'm trying to decide if I need to go on or not. In fact, I'm going to stop there because we have been reading for 20 minutes. And that's a natural place to stop because there's a big section break in the story. And we will come back for the next video, the rest of chapter 6, another time. But I hope you enjoyed that little bit. Not much happened, but the story moved on. And it will move on again in the next read. So maybe you accumulate them and you can read them both together, or maybe you stop with me right now and another night you carry on with the rest of the chapter. I hope you've enjoyed it. Did you notice how I needed to slow down? Because the sentences in this book are very long and complicated. And I need to make sure I'm reading ahead enough so that I know what inflections to make. And that I'm reading the punctuation carefully enough. So I know, again, what inflections to make so that my fluency is better and comprehension is improved. So I hope that your reading aloud is improving. I hope that you're enjoying the book. And catch me, Lauren, on Reading With Me on our YouTube channel, Amatis Learning Center. Until next time, bye-bye.